Hello everybody and welcome to Drydock episode 89. By the time you're listening to this, hopefully I'm on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, but never mind. Today's questions are taken from the video on SMS Königsberg and the C-class cruisers. Civis Hamburgum asks, at 3 minutes 15 into the Königsberg video, you show a picture of the ship with what is presumably the northern to Baltic Sea Channel. There is a text box on the left lower corner stating Zensiert Paul Hoffmann and Co. Berlin Schönberg. Since the word Zensiert does translate to the English word censored, I'd like to know what was censored. Well, here's the picture in question, and to be honest, I had a fair bit of difficulty trying to figure it out myself until I noticed a few minor visual discrepancies. And actually, the best way of looking at them is of spotting them is actually to look in the reflection in the water where they haven't done sensor work. And I can't quite figure out why they've done it, but if you look very carefully around the bow ornament and then look at the reflection of it in the water, there appears to be a bit more to that bow ornament than there is on the ship above water. And then you can see there's a similar patch of discoloration a little bit further back at the level of the main deck, where again, when you look in the reflection in the water, there's clearly some form of dark material or coating going on there, and the same with near the anchor chain and the anchor position on the port bow. There's definitely a lot more going on that bow than there is in this photo, which appears to have been touched up to make it look a bit cleaner, I guess. The only other place I could immediately find that kind of sort of patch of editing seems, again, for some reason that remains inexplicable to me, to be on the port side casement mounted gun just next to the bridge. And in this picture, it linearly seems to be, it's sort of below, just immediately below the first funnel, where they seem for some reason to have tried to censor out the actual gun itself, although not the casement, and also the fairing that allows that gun to fire a little bit further forwards. Again, I have no idea why they'd actually choose to censor this, but that appears to be what they've done. Christian Multhhaupt asks, talking about SMS Hohenzollern, was it common that state leaders' yachts were equipped with guns, and were those guns just for representational tasks, or were they to be used in a possible war? The exact nature of royal and state yachts armaments around that kind of period, late 19th, early 20th century, varied somewhat, but by and large, yes, practically all of them carried some form of weaponry. Quite how much and what its purpose was did vary from yacht by yacht. Some yachts appear to have guns that are effectively there for saluting and ceremonial purposes, maybe a very, very low-key kind of self-defense, but not that much else. Others were actually surprisingly heavily armed. Indeed, a number of yachts were either converted from or just flat out were warships, albeit small ones. And there's quite a number that kind of fall into a middle category where they might possess some weaponry more towards the ceremonial side, but they would have, like certain merchant ships that were built under license or under grant from various admiralties, with strengthened positions to allow the installation of weapons in the time of war to make them into kind of a third-class cruiser-ish, I guess, or some kind of aviso or something along those lines. And this was seems to actually have been quite common. For example, a number of the quote-unquote cruisers assigned to Rozhesvensky's squadrons appear to have been Russian nobles' yachts that were built with exactly this kind of thing in mind. Just they put guns on them and said, right, it's an unprotected cruiser now. Good luck with that one. So yes, everyone seems to have carried guns. If you wanted to rule as a majority, the majority of them either seem to have carried legitimate war purpose guns or be able to be fitted for them, and very, very few would seem to have carried purely ceremonial weapons, and those very, very few seem to be basically the state yachts from the countries that were large enough to afford a navy that was big enough that they wouldn't need every ship possible come wartime. So, yeah. Kevin Kenley asks, how much coal did one of these protected cruisers burn? Well, the answer basically depends on how fast is it going. I mean, there's other factors involved, like how fast can it go total, because a ship that can make, say, 18 knots maximum is going to burn a lot more fuel travelling at 12 knots than a ship that can make, say, 22 knots maximum travelling at 12 knots, because of the difference in efficiency of the engines and how far up towards the maximum rated power they are. But to give to give an example, the Königsberg, which is obviously the ship that in question from this video, seems to have been able to make at its cruising speed of about 12 knots. It can do about 6 to 7 miles per ton of coal. Now, its successor cruisers could only do 3 to 4 miles per ton of coal when at cruising speed, but their cruising speed was 2 knots higher at 14 knots. So, obviously, burning a bit more coal to go a bit faster. And to go away from the Kriegsmarine for a second, a similar contemporary, the Topaz class or Gem class, again, protected cruisers in the Royal Navy, they could make 5,500 nautical miles if they were cruising along at 10 knots. But if they were going at 20 knots, that cut their range almost in half to about 3,000 nautical miles. So the efficiency of how many miles per ton you could get out of a cruiser, how much coal they were burning, would vary quite wildly depending on, say, what kind of speed you were generally going at. But also the machinery, because if you take ships of the same class, and the Kriegsmarine ships are actually... well, not Kriegsmarine, the Imperial German fleet at this point, I should say. Sorry about that, slip up earlier. The Imperial German fleet, their cruisers quite often have relatively detailed coal storage versus distance travelled at certain speed data available. And you can see that even within the same class, okay, fair enough, they stored different amounts of coal, but when you work out the coal burn, the miles travelled per ton of coal burnt figures, even for ships within the same class, they all come out slightly differently. And this is obviously due to how good quality the coal in question is, what sea conditions are they encountering, because obviously making, say, 14 knots in a flat calm is a lot easier than making 14 knots in high seas. Plus, what exact machinery have they got, how expert is their engine crew, etc. So it's all a bit up in the air for any given vessel, but having run the numbers for about 30 or 40 different cruisers from the period, it seems that for the average cruising speed, which most of them seem to have had a cruising speed of between 10 and 15 knots, they were averaging something between 2, at the very worst, 2 up to about 7.5 at best miles per ton of coal. And then obviously however much coal they actually happen to have on board. I know that's a fairly wide range. To be honest, most of the average figures seem to come in about 4 to 5 miles per ton burned. But such is the nature of the different designs of cruiser at the time. John Trombley asks, is the distinguishing feature between destroyers and cruisers only size, or are there other properties of the ship that make it a destroyer or cruiser? And by extension, would it be possible to have a very small but presumably older cruiser at the same size or smaller than a very large and presumably newer destroyer? Generally speaking, there are actually quite major differences between cruisers and destroyers. However, at the same time, the second part of your question, yes, there were actually situations where cruisers and destroyers seemed to almost mix. The Italians and the French especially were very good at this, to the point that the biggest French destroyers, quote unquote, the contre-torpilliers, were actually classified by the US Navy as light cruisers in the latter part of World War II, because they were so big and so heavily armed compared to everybody else's destroyers. In the French case, it was definitely a case of they built their destroyers so big that everyone thought they were cruisers. The Italians, on the other hand, they kind of went in both directions in that they built very small light cruisers with the express intention and purpose of hunting down destroyers, but they were kind of built down to such a point that whether they were large destroyers or small cruisers was relatively difficult to work out, and some of the French super destroyers were actually bigger and heavier than them. And similarly, especially during the interwar period when there were a bunch of older World War I era cruisers around and the super destroyers were coming out, there were definitely, again, instances where the destroyers were heavier and larger, and in some cases even better armed than some of the older cruisers that were in service. And then, of course, you have the kind of halfway house designs, like, say, the Atlanta, which is kind of light cruiser size on the small side of things, but with a destroyer armament, just lots and lots of it. You've also got things like the Dido class. Now, the Dido class are slightly more definitively small cruisers than large destroyers, but their design lineage is actually even more explicitly a destroyer, having grown out of a design that eventually split to form the Didos and the Tribal class. So yes, there were, despite the clear differences in doctrine overall, there were actually cases of crossover. Now, in the more general case, the main distinguishing feature between a destroyer and a cruiser, once you got past the initial stage of a destroyer being a torpedo boat destroyer, and they became a kind of hybrid of both torpedo boat and torpedo boat destroyer, is that, generally speaking, a destroyer's main purpose was to escort. They obviously could be used on their own in flotillas, and they could be used to lead operations of small craft, etc. But from a fleet perspective, the destroyer's job was scouting, escorting, and torpedo assault. Now, okay, fair enough, in the Japanese Navy, those roles were also shared by the majority of the Japanese cruisers, but more generally, a cruiser's job was more geared towards independent action. It could have an escorting role when it came to battleships, say like the Prince Eugen with Bismarck or something similar, or Jamaica with Duke of York. But cruisers were a much more versatile breed. They were much longer range. They could operate for considerably longer periods of time, not just because of their range, but because of the supplies they had on board. Their armament was more geared around their guns, unless, of course, you were the Japanese. And even then, the Japanese actually ended up using their cruisers' guns a lot more often, as opposed to their torpedoes. The guns were obviously a lot heavier, and they were optimized towards taking out like vessels, whereas the destroyers generally, although they could and obviously did quite often actively fight each other, the destroyers' main objective was to try and punch well above their weight with those torpedo salvos and take out ships much bigger than they were. And in peacetime, destroyers would obviously operate with their flotillas, and they would stay close to fleet formations and bases. Cruisers would tend to go on the world tours and police shipping, escort shipping, etc. Now, destroyers obviously did come into the escort role, especially when it came to anti-submarine work, but it actually turned out the qualities you need for a fleet destroyer actually make for a fairly terrible convoy escort. So that very rapidly became the realm of second-line destroyers, frigates, corvettes, sloops, destroyer escorts, etc. So yeah, there was actually, it's not just the size, it is they also do have very separate roles. The cruiser is almost to echo the words of Jackie Fisher when talking about the armoured cruiser, but effectively the cruiser is almost, in a lot of respects, a small capital ship in terms of its uses, whereas a destroyer is very much, in almost all navies, an escort ship to something larger. Feuer asks, would Admiral Spee in World War I have successfully reached Germany if his fleet didn't engage at the Falkland Islands and continued his journey towards Germany? My gut instinct says no, but there are one or two scenarios where it might be possible. So let me explain. The main reason I say no, probably not, is that even if you'd bypass the Falkland Islands completely, you still had the two battle cruisers there that were waiting, and they were faster than von Spee's ships by a considerable margin. I mean, they were faster just on paper when you look at their stats, but then you have to bear in mind as well that von Spee's ships hadn't seen a good cleaning since, since they left Tsingtao, and also, similarly, their machinery was not necessarily on its way out, but also not necessarily in the best state of repair. So they were actually a little bit slower than, well, their paper stats would suggest, whereas the Admiral Sturdy's two ships had basically just come fresh from the UK. So, assuming that he did bypass the Falklands, the two battle cruisers were easily capable of catching up to him and overhauling him and engaging him, at which point it's the Battle of the Falklands all over again, just somewhere slightly different. Now, it is, however, possible that von Spee might evade them, not by outrunning them, but by going in a completely different direction. So, let's say the most obvious short course would be to stick to the western side of the Atlantic up until you get past the promontory of Brazil, and then kind of skedaddle across in a diagonal line to try and get towards the coast of Europe, maybe Portugal, Spain, France area. Or alternative, there are various other routes you could try. But anyway, if he'd gone past the Falklands, realised that the British were in pursuit, and then, say, swung a hard right and gone to operate off the West African coast, that might have thrown the battle cruisers long enough for him to then make a further evasive manoeuvre. But ultimately, he is heading north, and then, so assuming that he manages to somehow dodge the battle cruisers, you've then got the British and French ships in the Mediterranean, and this early in the war, they're not tied down with the Gallipoli campaign, although Goeben and Breslau are contained. So there's a fair few ships in the Mediterranean, more than are strictly necessary. So if he did get something approaching that far north, you can guarantee those forces probably would have thrown a screen and several squadrons of ships out to stop him. Then, assuming that he somehow managed to evade them as well, you've got ships in the Caribbean, so they might well try to intercept him. And then, assuming he dodges those in addition to that, going up the channel is probably near enough suicidal, considering that one side is controlled by France, one side is controlled by the UK, and there's a fair number of pre-dreadnought battleships there. So he'd almost have to do a Bismarck in reverse, and I have no idea whether in fact, I'm pretty sure he doesn't have enough fuel to pull that particular stunt off if he's running full tilt all the way from the Falklands. In theory, he could try and keep capturing merchant ships and pilfering their coal supplies, but quite how many merchant ships you'd have to overhaul and pilfer to keep the East Asia Squadron going, as well as their obviously keeping their engines going, and hope that none of them manage to get a signal out that pinpoints his location. We're getting further and further from the realms of the possible, but still not impossible. So he could then try and do a run through the Denmark Strait or similar, but then he has the problem of, at that point, the British probably know roughly where he is, and then you've got to get past the Grand Fleet and the battle cruiser fleet. And if he's made it this far, that's going to be a major bit of egg on the face of the Royal Navy, so you can guarantee they're going to pull out all the stops to try and stop him getting back to Germany. And they do actually have a fairly substantial blockade line in that area, assuming he doesn't trigger off any of the western approaches blockading forces anyway, keeping an eye on merchant shipping. So at that point, he'll probably get the battle cruiser fleet dropped on him, assuming the Grand Fleet doesn't wander into the picture as well. So yeah, his chances of making it home are very slim indeed, albeit that if by some absolute miracle he manages to get most or all of his ships all the way around to the point that they might be tripping wires on the North Sea blockade and setting off the Grand Fleet, you could, in theory, posit that the Kaiser, having seen just how far von Spee's made it, might just send the High Seas Fleet out as at least as an ostensible distraction to allow von Spee's fleet to slip past. Whether that would work or not is an entirely different matter, and quite what would develop from that is again a very, very different matter. But yes, if all the stars align, all the dice come up sixes, and he gets a royal flush in his nightly card game, there is a very, very, very remote possibility he might have done it. Practically speaking, though, no, he probably would have run into one squadron or another at some point, or else the ships would have run out of fuel or broken down. Most likely scenario, if he somehow manages to get out the South Atlantic, is probably internment in America. That would probably be about the safest and most realistic option. Kathleen McManus asks, when do you plan to show the video on HMS Caroline? Basically, when I can get a word in edgeways with the National Museum of the Royal Navy, of which HMS Caroline is a part. There are quite a few ships and facilities like the obviously Portsmouth Historic Dockyard and Caroline that are all part of the National Museum of the Royal Navy, and I have been reaching out to various organisations who run various museum ships and such like in the UK, including obviously National Museum of the Royal Navy, Imperial War Museum for HMS Belfast, SS Great Britain, Chatham Dockyards, etc., plus a few overseas, to talk to them about filming permissions and such like. And I have received a couple of responses so far. So I'm talking with the chaps from SS Great Britain, also from Belfast, and also actually from another ship which you'll see hopefully in the next couple of months. Which will hopefully be a bit of a surprise, but unfortunately, so far, despite calling them a couple of times and speaking to them on the phone, I have yet to hear back from the National Museum of the Royal Navy, which is Portsmouth Historic Dockyard and Caroline in particular. So when they get back to me, hopefully with a positive response, then I shall be heading to Belfast and I shall do some filming on HMS Caroline, and then I'll be able to bring you the video. I just didn't think it was going to take this long. But, oh well. Andrea Marioni asks, if it had been completed in 1940 as originally intended, for all its design flaws, would the Graf Zeppelin have posed a severe threat to the Royal Navy? That is, would the Germans have been able to use it to attack British naval bases such as Scapa Flow in a manner similar to how the British attacked the Italian fleet at Taranto with HMS Illustrious in 1940? So, severe threat? No. Threat? Certainly. I mean, it's might not be the world's best aircraft carrier by a fairly large margin, but it's still an aircraft carrier. And by completing it in 1940, I'm going to presume that you also mean that Goering actually allowed the Kriegsmarine to have some aircraft for a change, because otherwise it is fairly useless. Well, I suppose it could be a gigantic BT-style battle cruiser carrier thing like you wanted to make the Eagle, but enough about that. The reason I say not a severe threat is because when you look at the various mission profiles you could have put Graf Zeppelin on, there's not a tremendous amount that stands out immediately as something the Germans couldn't already have done. So, like, take Taranto, for example. Could Graf Zeppelin have launched an airstrike against Taranto? Yes, it could. What would have happened? Probably not a spectacular amount, because the Germans were already bombing Scapa Flow, mostly with, I believe, Fliegerkorps 5, based out in Norway, because Fliegerkorps 2 and 3 didn't really like having to send their bombers the full length of Great Britain to attack Scapa Flow. It tended to have a rather deleterious effect on the pilot's ability to stay alive. But Fliegerkorps 5 was quite happily sending things like Junkers 88s over to bomb Scapa Flow, so having an air raid on Scapa Flow was nothing new for the Royal Navy. And obviously also, radar. That kind of makes the whole attack by air thing a little less of a surprise than the Italians suffered at Taranto. Albeit that obviously the Graf Zeppelin would have been able to launch a closer strike Probably a little bit more of a concentrated strike focusing on torpedo bombers. So the strike itself may have posed more danger, but a strike in and of itself would not have been like a shocking development for the Royal Navy. And obviously, with the Royal Navy planning Taranto, if they knew that the Germans had Graf Zeppelin in service, they would probably be anticipating the Germans trying something similar on them. And so the defences probably would have been upgraded to help deal with that. Now, as far as everything else, well, as I say, it's in the North Sea. Anything really that could be attacked by the Graf Zeppelin in that operational environment could have been attacked by the Luftwaffe by 1940 because of all the various places that Germany had taken over. Where the threat comes in is not so much the novelty of air attack, but the specific response time. So if, say, you have Renown versus Sharnhorst and Gneisenau, or Gneisenau, or however on earth people are pronouncing it these days, there could have been a good example of Graf Zeppelin's utility. I mean, it's not going to be launching any aircraft in that particular storm, but once that storm abates somewhat, then assuming Graf Zeppelin had been maybe 50, 60 miles further south, it would have been in a position to launch some form of airstrike that might stand a decent chance of finding the Renown, whereas, for all the fact that, yes, the Luftwaffe could technically have attacked Renown, the distance between the air bases and actually getting out there, plus the whole communications between the Luftwaffe and the Kriegsmarine, would have meant any response would have been far too delayed to be practically useful. So, yes, there would have definitely been a threat there. Albeit, again, we don't want to fall into the trap of just adding a piece to the game board and assuming that everyone else is going to act in exactly the same manner, because obviously if the Kriegsmarine does have Graf Zeppelin around, the chances are that the Royal Navy is going to try and make sure that its own capital ship operations have some form of air support, whether that be from a carrier or from the RAF. So it would completely change the way operations in the North Sea and the surrounding areas are actually done. But in and of itself, I don't think Graf Zeppelin contains enough firepower to be a substantial individual threat, as, like you said, a severe threat to the Royal Navy. About the only place that might change somewhat would be, because I can hear the inevitable sounds of people saying, well, what if it had sailed with the Bismarck? Yes, if it had sailed with the Bismarck and Prinz Eugen, that would quite substantially change things. But at the same time, I'm pretty sure if it had been Bismarck, Graf Zeppelin and Prinz Eugen sailing, then you probably would have seen King George V and Victorious come out with Prince of Wales and Hood, which would have been an interesting matchup to say the least. H.J. Fleischman asks, do you plan on doing any videos on proposed ship designs which we never got? Yeah, I've done a few, things like the Mackinsons, Riachuelo, obviously Montana on display here, etc., etc. I'm not opposed to doing 5-minute guides to ship designs that never were, but where I kind of would like to draw the line is ships that we didn't get to see, but that were pretty much at their final design stage or possibly even under construction. So under construction will be something like the Montanas or the Mackinsons or Lexingtons, etc. Something where the design was finalised would be something like the Riachuelo, which, as I said, we've already done, or something like the G3s. Technically, they were kind of started, the N3s, and that kind of thing. The Admiral class battle cruisers, i.e. the 3 that the Royal Navy was planning to build after Hood, which were reasonably substantially different, again, would also be something I'd be willing to cover. Once you get past those kind of ships, though, you start to slide more and more into the hypothetical territory. And that's somewhere in that region is where I draw the line, because you run out of information very quickly, because where there hasn't been substantial design work, you only have the absolute bare bones of statistics, which you could probably list off in like 90 seconds, to be perfectly honest, and then everything else is guesswork or extrapolation based off of previous designs, which is just educated guesswork, and that's not really a way to fill out a 5-minute guide, to be perfectly honest. For those kind of designs, I would probably cover a batch of them, mentioning briefly roughly what their capabilities would be, because one of the other things that you really have to bear in mind is that a lot of the bugs that affect overall actual ship performance tend to be found during the final design process or even during the building and trials process. So a ship that has a certain performance in real life, generally speaking, will have a slightly better performance on paper, which will be, and then it'll have a slightly better performance to that if you look at the initial copy of the final design, and if you look then even further back at the kind of the sketch form that eventually became that, the on-paper performance will usually jump even higher, unless they started out with a really ambitious design and had to cut it down and down and down and down. So, as I say, at some point you're going to end up far enough back in the design process that A, you don't have much substantial to actually go on in terms of making a video, and B, you're going to be sitting there going, why didn't they build this ship? It would have been so much better than everything else at the time. And the reason it looks so much better than everything else is because it is literally a fantasy design, effectively, that no one's actually had to stress test and do the detailed calculations for. It's very easy to pull off those kind of designs and proclaim yourself a ship design god, but putting it into practice, something of a different story. So yeah, I'm trying to think of some examples. So the lead-up ships, say, to the G3 and N3s, so the LMs, Ks, etc., those I would probably cover in a single, whether it's a 5-minute guide or a special, on the hypothetical designs that led up to those two classes, G3 and N3. But I wouldn't give them their own 5-minute guides, for example, individually. And likewise, the various US battle cruiser studies that led up to the Lexington. Again, sort of a working history of US battle cruiser designs would be a nice video to do, but I wouldn't try and do a single definitive guide on each individual potential class. So yeah, hopefully that clarifies that for you. HipCat13 asks, which submarine service was best in terms of boats and crews, the US Navy or the Kriegsmarine? Oh, well, would you look at that little lovely minefield you've laid for me?
Hooray!
Now watch me merrily try to skip my way through this one.
Aww, no new friends.
So my answer in this respect is going to be relatively complicated, and to be honest, probably going to take us up to the Patreon questions on this particular dry dock. So let's see how we go. In terms of the crews, at the start of World War II, and going up to probably mid to late 42, I would say crew advantage goes to the Kriegsmarine, in part because they've actually been training for and expecting this kind of war, so they've been doing a lot more specific training and exercises. Plus, some of them have a little bit of held-over combat experience from World War I, albeit that most of those people are in the higher echelons by now. So they're going into the conflict with a bit more experience, a bit more an idea of what they're doing, and then on top of that, you have the fact that, well, up until from the end of 1941 through to the end of 1942, say, at that point, you're talking about U-boats that, at least for the more successful ones, have been operating for the better part of 2 to 3 years already in wartime environments, whereas the US submariners are going to get kind of chucked in at the deep end, literally, straight into a wartime environment. So they are obviously going to have less operational experience. However, by the time you get to late 42, early 43, at this point, the US submariners have combat experience under their belts, and the casualty rates due to improved technology, escort processes, etc., amongst the Allied navies have also meant that a lot of the Kriegsmarine's more experienced U-boat crews are gone at that point. So you now have a situation where you have a US Navy submarine corps that has a good set of experienced crews, and a Kriegsmarine submarine corps that is more and more relying on relatively freshly trained crews. So in overall terms, I think around that point, that's when you would see the crew advantage shift from the Germans to the Americans, albeit obviously with the caveats that there would still be some very, very skilled Kriegsmarine U-boat captains and crews who survived much or all of the war, who would obviously always have a significant combat advantage over all but the absolute best American subcrews. And obviously that kind of that general trend would exacerbate the further on through the war you went. In terms of the boats themselves, that is a lot harder to quantify because, as I've covered in other similar questions, I think a few Drydocks previously when we were talking about the Japanese Navy versus the Kriegsmarine in this respect, they have very different operational requirements. The Kriegsmarine is operating in a big, dark, cold ocean, as well as fairly dark and cold coastal waters against an enemy that is pretty much on the ball with anti-submarine warfare, at least as far as you can be in World War II. The US Navy is operating in a much warmer environment, in seas that are generally speaking, not always, but generally speaking somewhat calmer, against an enemy whose anti-submarine warfare experience and expertise is somewhat lacking, but is also struggling with significantly worse weapons in the form of the Mark 14 torpedo until it gets fixed, as opposed to the Germans, who also had their issues, but fixed them a little bit quicker than that. So, boat technology-wise, a Gato versus a Type 7, on paper the Gato, Gato, whatever, and the Balaus are significantly superior to a Type 7. You look at Type 9 or something else similar, then the gap closes, but again, different requirements for different operational theatres. Would a Gato or a Balau have done especially well trying to hunt in the Western Approaches or the North Sea? Probably not. Would a Type 7 have done particularly well trying to operate from Midway or Pearl Harbor to go and sail off the Japanese coast? Almost certainly not. So that makes it very, very difficult to quantify precisely. Obviously, towards the end of the war, the Germans developed things like the Type 21s. The Americans developed some boats that can go incredibly deep. And the boats that you see built after the war are a combination of those two technologies, as actually was covered in the Balau guide. Between advances the Americans and the other allies themselves had made and the advances that were captured from the Germans in the form of the Electra boats and such, the Gato, Balau, Tench format was pretty much obsoleted by those advances almost immediately after World War II. But the submarines themselves weren't worth throwing away in large part. So, yeah, boat-wise, I'm not going to give a call one way or the other during the war, other than to say that the Electra boats, obviously, and other such German technology, whilst it may not have necessarily worked 100% of the time, certainly was pointing towards the future a little bit more than the majority of the US subs that were being built towards the end of World War II. But then obviously the flip side is quantity is a quality all of its own. How many Electra boats were there versus how many Balaus and Tenches? You can't accomplish all that much with a handful of Electra boats compared to, we have 150 to 200 of these things, which the US Navy could do. So, yeah, hopefully minefield avoided. Ding ding. Admiral Tiberius asks, if you could paint current Royal Navy and US Navy ships in 2 or 3 different historical paint schemes, such as summer, winter, or peacetime or war, which ones would they be? Well, I think I've gone on record before as saying I think bringing back the Victorian peacetime camo as modelled here on a Type 45 would greatly improve the performance and improvement of everything. I mean, look at that. That is just... It's so much better than a flat grey. The thing that's really irritating me actually at the moment is that there was a picture that somebody shared to me over a year ago now, which had a bunch of US Navy ships. I think there was an Arleigh Burke and a Zumwalt at least in Great White Fleet colours, which also looked really good, but I can't find at the moment, so I'm stuck to using just the Type 45 here. But if anyone has a copy of those images as well, please share them in the comments so people can see. So yes, I'd bring back Great White Fleet camo for the US Navy, although I'm pretty sure the crews would probably hate me for the maintenance that would involve, and I'd definitely bring back Victorian camo for the Royal Navy. And if we have to have more than one, then keep this around for most of the time, and then just put the sort of the MC Escher Dazzle camo on during wartime. Because let's face it, in an era of radar and missile systems, whether you painted grey, Dazzle, this or whatever is not going to make that much difference. So you might as well give anybody who's trying to visually spot you a minor seizure by putting very, very crazy camo patterns on your ships. Mikko Leitner asks, how do you see Allied casualties if nukes don't exist and the Allies are forced to go through with Operation Downfall? And also, how would you rate the Finnish Navy against the Kriegsmarine in 1940-41? For the Finnish Navy versus the Kriegsmarine, it depends entirely on what part of 1940-41 you're talking about, because the Kriegsmarine's strength varies massively during this period. If, for example, you were to take the early 1940 Kriegsmarine, just before the invasion of Norway, then the Finnish Navy stands very little chance at all. I mean, the Finnish Navy, at the beginning of World War II, you're talking about Väinämöinen and Ilmarinen, which, okay, fair enough. But then beyond that, there's no other cruisers, no other destroyers, just sort of gunboats, torpedo boats, mine layers, and a handful of submarines. So against the force that Germany was able to put up against Norway, so you've got Blücher, Hipper, in that environment you could actually bring out the Königsbergs and Nürnbergs as well, a couple of dozen destroyers, Sharnhorst, Gneisenau, etc. Yeah, the Finnish Navy with just these two coast defence ships is not going to stand up to a concerted German squadron, and the rest of it, unfortunately, is probably, apart from the submarines, is clearable by just the destroyer flotillas, let alone anything else. However, I have the same inference if you go just a few months later to the end of the Norwegian campaign, then all of a sudden the Finnish Navy actually does stand a relatively decent chance, because a bunch of the German destroyers are on the seabed, a number of the Königsberg-Nürnberg overall group are also sunk or damaged. Both Scharnhorst and Gneisenau are out of action, having been torpedoed. Blücher is, of course, on the bottom. Hipper is damaged thanks to glowworm, at which point Väinämöinen and Ilmarinen, with the various light craft standing up to what's left of the Kriegsmarine, which is basically a few questionable light cruisers and some destroyers at the absolute worst point. Yeah, actually at that point the Finnish Navy might stand a decent chance of driving them off. But then, of course, they repair, rebuild, etc. And at sort of early 1941, you might have Bismarck. Late 1941, you might just about get Tirpitz. So swings and roundabouts all over the place, really. In terms of casualties, if Operation Downfall had been forced to go ahead, well, the casualty estimates range all over the place, but they're always ridiculously high. I mean, the US famously manufactured enough Purple Heart medals, which is the medal for being wounded in action, that in anticipation of Operation Downfall, that they're still using them. They're still using that stock. So yes, the total American casualties in the Korean War, Vietnam War, Gulf War, Iraq, Afghanistan, and any other small conflict the US has gotten involved in since World War II still don't add up to the total anticipated number of casualties that they're thinking for Operation Downfall. But a lot of that is land-based, and obviously I'm not a land-based military historian, so I'm not going to go into the exact details of that. In terms of casualties for the naval side of things, I think that is going to be very interesting. The Japanese were retaining an awful lot of kamikazes. And whilst kamikaze attacks were broken up during various invasions, including places like Okinawa, the simple fact of the matter is that if you're invading the Japanese home islands themselves, you're going to have a lot less warning, which gives you a lot less opportunity to intercept. And also they're going to be turning up in absolutely massive numbers, so there is a potential for the kamikaze attacks to just overwhelm the defences of the various invasion fleets if they get their numbers concentrated. Now, whether or not that would happen is very open-ended, but you've also got to take into account things like kamikaze boats and such like. Now, the Japanese did still have a few proper warships around, but most of them were knocked out, that they had still had in port, was still knocked out in the latter stages of the historical campaign, that played ships like Nagato, for example. So those probably aren't going to be available for any kind of last-ditch kamikaze run, but they did have a lot of midget submarines and things like this, very short sort of coastal, short-range kamikaze and dash self-defense craft. So without modelling it in exact detail, it's difficult to say, other than to mention that the possibility of mass casualties does exist. There's every chance that these units might be fed into battle piecemeal, in which case the combined firepower of the Allied fleets is more than capable of dealing with them, and given the fact that you had Allied battleship squadrons randomly shooting up Tokyo Bay with relative impunity. But the Japanese do have sufficient numbers of kamikaze aircraft, midget subs, boats, etc. on hand that if there is a large massing of Allied shipping that's actually invading the Japanese home islands, they could potentially throw enough of them into the mix to, as I say, to saturate the Allied defences and then get through and cause significant mass casualty events. Especially when you're talking about an invasion specifically, because the fleet, sort of the carriers, the battleships, the cruisers, etc., can, unless they're absolutely and utterly overwhelmed, can probably still handle themselves fairly well. But they've also got to protect the invasion fleet, and the landing craft are nowhere near as well protected in and of their own air defences, and there are an awful lot more of them, and they're a lot more fragile. So a mass kamikaze attack that targets the troop transports, for example, might cause thousands or tens of thousands of casualties, even if they don't sink that many ships, because a fully laden troop transport is going to have a lot of people on board, to say nothing of if they start picking off random things like the landing craft. And of course, as I say, if you do manage to get, say, 4 or 5 kamikazes pancaking into a something like an Essex class, that's probably going to total that ship with a lot of casualties, and so on and so forth. So a bit of an open-ended question and an open-ended answer, I'm afraid, there. Bill Brockman asks, if the Kriegsmarine had realised their U-boats were being plotted and hunted by radio intercept and code breaking, what would they have done? Lone hunters under radio silence? Possibly. I mean, certainly if they realised that all their signals are being read, one of the first things they would have done would have been to temporarily tell everybody to operate on their own, because the only thing that's worse than leaving boats to fend for themselves is to point the Allies in the direction of the U-boats. But I think almost certainly the first thing they would have done would be change their codes, change their encryption methods. And there were, as I covered in the video on Enigma, which looks at just one part of that whole struggle, there were periods when the Allies couldn't read the German codes. So when, say, for example, when they added a fourth rotor, there was a period where that had to be reverse engineered and worked out. And there were other types of encryption available to them, such as the encryption type that actually required the invention of the Colossus computer at Bletchley Park. And again, as covered there were times when German officers did suspect that they were being decrypted, and they recommended something be done about it. But in the end, obviously, most of the German higher-ups didn't listen to that. So, yeah, I think if they actually had hard and fast proof or enough of a body of evidence to make it fairly probable that they thought they were being having all their codes decrypted, the first step would have been to change all their encoding, whether that be by addition of more rotors or adoption of a new encryption method. They really wanted to maintain that that ability to centrally command and coordinate the U-boats. So they would have desperately tried to increase and upgrade their encryption capabilities to ensure that the Allies couldn't read their codes and they could carry on as normal. Now, if for whatever reason it became apparent that this was not going to work, then I suspect they probably would have had to do something along the lines of much more detailed briefings to the U-boat commanders before they left, and yeah, at that point leave them to hunt on their own, or possibly in small groups working under local coordination. And that would have been possible in as much as if you only have to convey a very limited number of orders to a very limited group of individuals for a very short period of time, i.e., say, a wolf pack that's operating in the mid-Atlantic, you could then actually have secured the encryption of their transmissions by using something like a one-time pad, something that has no relation to anything in particular, is completely random, and won't be decipherable until long after it's actually had its usefulness expended. So you could have, say, a wolf pack of a dozen U-boats strung out in a line, and they all have a copy of this one-time pad, and it just says, right, for this mission, if you receive the signal Munich, then that means convoy is present near U-boat U446 or something. So, yeah, just transmitting Munich doesn't mean anything to anybody. You could even transmit that in the clear, and it's not going to mean anything to the Allies, but it would mean something to those boats on in the pack. But pattern recognition is a thing. It would only work for so long. So yeah, you'd have to come up with dozens of these pads for each wolf pack's voyage. I think that would probably have been plausible. I mean, knowing the Germans, they probably would have tried other weird and wonderful things, like probably a lot of focus into directional transmission. I can even see them even trying to have sort of maybe rejigging the FW200s, the Condors, and sending them out with short-range radio, like physically carrying orders out to the area and then transmitting over shorter distances so the U-boats can pick them up, but the transmissions won't hopefully leak out back to the UK in a readable format. Timo Fiebig asks, what would change if the ironclad race of armour versus guns was won by armour? For example, because of some mysterious reason, guns over a specific size can't work, and that size is the one where you can still feasibly armour a ship against. Well, if guns don't work, then Admiral Tegethoff is going to go down in history as the prophet of the future, given his actions at the Battle of Lissa. So you're going to see rams actually become a legitimate and widespread part of naval fleets. You've also got the fact that although guns can't penetrate the armour, they will still be able to set things on fire and destroy upper works, etc., which means that the whole hail of fire doctrine that was advocated for in the sort of early to mid pre-Dreadnought period actually now again becomes a completely viable, and indeed probably the only viable, use of guns in the overall context. Heavy guns will still have a place to some degree for taking out lighter armoured ships, but that means that you're probably actually going to see heavy guns relocated to sort of maybe one or two on things like armoured cruisers to help take down other cruisers and such like. Whereas on battleships, their sheer size means that the weight of fire that they can put out with numerous smaller guns is probably actually going to become more relevant. So you might actually see the heaviest guns carried on smaller ships, albeit the armoured cruisers were larger than pre-dreadnoughts generally, but as size expands, obviously, the battleship overtakes the cruiser. So yes, ramming, torpedoes definitely also become a thing a lot earlier, because if armour is so strong, then you can close to point-blank range, and if you can close to point-blank range, then even the earliest torpedoes with run distances measured in a few thousand yards become very viable weapons, and indeed become possibly the only viable point defence weapon against an incoming heavy ram ship. And of course the ram ships are also going to be deploying loads of torpedo tubes against their targets to help put them down there. So the whole thing goes back to a very sort of melee-focused type thing, and indeed you might even, believe it or not, see the return of boarding actions to a certain degree. Because if everyone's going to get into sort of point-blank ramming distance and agility of ships becomes a lot more apparent, then something that makes a good ram ship, i.e. small, fast, heavily armoured, but otherwise relatively lightly crewed, is going to be fairly vulnerable to being hauled in alongside a large battleship with a large number of crew with a lot of quick-firing guns to clear the decks, etc. So potentially, by the time you reach sort of the Dreadnought era, where it's almost going to be Age of Sail style mass numbers of small guns, the whole concept of a sort of a big Dreadnought battleship just cruising around, invulnerable to almost anything that you can throw it at a distance, and then hauling smaller ships alongside and capturing them, might actually see a resurgence, almost galleon-type warfare at that point. Graham R. asks, in your opinion, what was the single most unlucky class of warship that had more than 2 members? Well, if we're looking at larger ships, I would have to say, ironically enough, given the layouts are very similar, the tie would be for me between the Invincible class and its subclass, I guess. The Indefatigables, they're often put in as their own class, but they're really just slightly warmed over versions of the Invincible, so I sometimes think of them as a subclass, so it means between 3 and 6 strong. Now, the reason I say they're unlucky is, well, 2 of them exploded at Jutland. I would count that as fairly unlucky, but despite the presence of HMS New Zealand in their ranks, which of course was a very lucky ship, and HMAS Australia, which is the one I was trying to say earlier, which obviously was paid for by Australia, overall the class has a bad run of luck. I mean, HMS Australia was sunk due to the Washington Naval Treaty, rather ignominiously. The others were broken up, the 3 survivors. But the reason I say they're unlucky is because they have kind of gone down in history as something of a meme ship, known mostly for exploding. However, at the time of their construction, they were absolutely superb. They were a brilliant example of sort of both political and practical intrigue. They'd managed to completely deceive the Germans as to what they were building. Their role was to hunt down and kill armoured cruisers and protected cruisers, and in that respect, as displayed at the Battle of the Falkland Islands in 1914, they were spot-on perfect for their role. Unfortunately, the Germans then turned around and built their own battle cruisers, and the British then ended up putting the Invincibles and Indefatigables up against both German battle cruisers and capital ships, which is not what they were ever designed to do. And as well as that, the pace of technological advancement and change during the 1900s and 1910s meant that a ship that was an absolute top-of-the-line cruiser killer in 1906, 1907, by 1916 was slower than the other battle cruisers, wasn't anywhere near protected enough to stand up in a battle cruiser fight, and kind of a victim of their own success with the Battle of the Falkland Islands, was then reduced to basically doing just that. And so in a lot of actions, the Invincible-Indefatigable class that were present in the North Sea ended up sort of turning up a little bit late because they were slower than everybody else, and then you got the chase of the Goeben and things like that. So they really had a bit of an unfortunate bad run of luck compared to where they were at the beginning. And to give you some idea of context for that, you think about something like, say, the Alaskas as cruiser killers built in the mid-1940s. Now, imagine that battleship construction had continued on for whatever reason. Let's say World War II doesn't happen for some reason. And then the Alaskas end up fighting something like a Montana. Well, obviously not at the Montana because they're on the same side, but something along those lines size-wise, or an auto-loading Lion class, or the Japanese Super Yamatos with the 20-inch guns or something like that. It's not a perfect analogy, but I think it suffices to say if they end up going against something like that, or one of the proposed retrofits for Kentucky, obviously assuming that someone else does this kind of thing, something sort of a battleship-sized vessel that's mounting over a dozen rapid-firing 8-inch or 12-inch guns in the mid-1950s, perhaps with missiles as well, and the Alaska class understandably then gets blown out of the water, people are going to go, oh yeah, well, that was clearly a stupid thing to do. No, not in the mid-1940s when they were building it. The naval designers are not clairvoyant, unfortunately. And the other one that I would give joint unlucky ship title for the capital ship category would be the España class dreadnoughts of Spain, who tragically became the only above two ship capital ship class to suffer total loss of all ships. So one went aground, one hit a mine, and the other one randomly exploded. You'll find pretty much every other capital ship class where there's a total class loss is 2 ships or less. So say both Bismarck and Tirpitz were sunk. Sharnhorst and Gneisenau were sunk. Nagato and Mutsu technically sunk. I mean, Mutsu did the whole self-destruction thing, but yes, the Españas basically never actually got involved in a full-fledged shooting war, which you can say for something like the Congos, you could excuse, well, yeah, they were in a full war, and it's not surprising they were all eventually lost, but the Españas all managed to get themselves just lost by relatively mundane means. They never saw a big fight, they never saw a massive battle, they were never used for the intended purpose, and they ended up on opposite sides of a civil war and then ended up all being lost. So yeah, they're also very unlucky vessels. And because we're in lockdown, let's give you one last big set of questions to bear through. So Christopher Brandt asks 3 questions. He says, I know of the Dutch ship that disguised itself as an island to evade the Japanese in the Pacific Theatre. Did any other nations try to disguise ships in port or near coastlines to avoid bombing? I think it might have proven effective for the Germans if they could hide Gneisenau and Sharnhorst in Brest prior to the Channel Dash to avoid photo recon and bombing. The Italians could also have used it to hide their fleet from Taranto. Second question, you talked about a sweet spot for naval building prior to the First World War, where Britain's naval building plans were centred on the 2-power standard, and infamously the Germans started building lots of ships for no other reason than to use them against Britain. Was there a similar case in the lead up to the Second World War, i.e. did Britain shift naval building plans to counter or better combat the Kriegsmarine or Italian Navies? And then finally, what is your real-life job? Well, I don't know about real life. This is also happening in real life, shockingly enough, and actually is turning into something of a job in and of itself. But my day job, the job I was... Actually, no, I wasn't doing this when I started the channel. I was working for somebody else. But anyway, my day job at the moment is working for Croydon Council in London as an engineer, helping to look after the growth zone, which is big rebuilding of central Croydon. And for those of you who might be panicking now, that's not actually information that's hidden from anyone. I did share that on like the second live stream that I did. Apparently there's even a subscriber that shares the same work building, or did share the same work building as me now that we're all working from home, but never mind. So yes, that is my day job kind of thing. That's a nice big pair of modular towers that are being built that I actually get along with that site very well. Very interesting to see as well. Giant Lego building, effectively. Now, as for leading up into the Second World War, did Britain shift its naval building plans? Yes. Yes, they did. a lot of it was already in train, but the early to mid-1930s, the Royal Navy's building plans were very much centred around the idea of a war in the Far East, i.e. a war against Japan, which they thought was going to be the most likely opponent. And a lot of their building for things like, say, Ark Royal, the Town Class, etc., all reflects that. But towards the mid to late 1930s, then they start to come around to the idea that there's probably going to be a war in Europe, and so building emphasis starts to change slightly towards building ships and submarines, etc., that are more suited to fighting in the North Sea, the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, etc. And obviously a lot more emphasis on things like preparing plans and designs and contingencies for convoy escorts, although that does not quite kick off quite in time. But the fact that they managed to get things put together relatively quickly once the need becomes apparent does show a certain degree of underlying thinking. So yes, there is a certain degree of shift, but it depends on what scale of ship you're looking at. Everything from the smallest sloop and minesweeper all the way up to carriers and battleships. There are all sorts of things. I mean, the things like, say, even Vanguard. Vanguard is put into production as a sort of a quick stop-gap battleship, specifically because they're envisaging a potential two-front war, possibly a conflict in Europe and a conflict in the Far East, and so they need an extra battleship stat to make sure that they have enough ships for both. So, yes, there's that. Now, as far as ships being disguised to avoid bombing, yes, various navies did get involved in that. Here is Ilmarinen of the Finnish Navy doing its level best to pretend to be part of the coastline. Now, the efficacy of these measures varies quite considerably. Firstly, you've got to consider that this kind of camouflage doesn't go on quickly and doesn't come off quickly. So it's very much a defensive measure. If you need your ship to be able to rapidly respond to ongoing situations and such, this is not a good idea. Because, well, if you imagine, say, with Bismarck escaping, if HMS Hood had been disguised in this kind of manner prior to leaving to head off for that battle, one, it would have looked incredibly stupid. Mind you, I would have loved to see the Germans' reactions on what appears to be a large forest coming over the horizon. Shades of Macbeth there. But equally, it would have been A, a massive fire hazard, and B, it would have probably slowed the ship down considerably as well. So for a ship that you want to use offensively, it's not such a good idea. But also, you have to factor in how much does your enemy know about the place that you're hiding in. So for Ilmarinen here, just in a random part of Finland, or the unpronounceable Dutch ship, then for them it worked because they were hiding in areas that their enemies had not had any particular reason to survey or look at previously. And so they, on photo reconnaissance, would have not any particular idea as to whether or not this particular outcropping had been there or not before. Whereas if you're looking at something like, say, Scapa Flow, you can try and make the ships harder to spot, but you're not going to be able to disguise them as something else, because the Germans will have plenty of aerial photos of Scapa Flow, and even if you do an absolute perfect disguise, the Germans are going to sort of look at their photos and go, well, in our previous photos of Scapa Flow, the surrounding terrain looked like this, and now there is a suspiciously Revenge-class battleship-sized promontory next to this part that used to be just cliff. I wonder what it could be. And similarly, for something like Sharnhorst and Gneisenau hiding out in Brest, the RAF knows perfectly well what the outline of those dockyards looks like, and a couple of mysterious Scharnhorst-shaped buildings, or Scharnhorst-sized buildings showing up where they previously weren't, and it was previously open water, it's not exactly rocket science to figure out where they are. Now with Taranto, Taranto sits in a kind of a bit of a weird middle space with that, in as much as to a certain degree it falls into the same category as the aforementioned Sharnhorst disguise scenario, in that the RAF knows what Taranto looks like. They're not going to be fooled, and the Royal Navy, they're not going to be fooled by the idea that there are suddenly half a dozen mysterious battleship-shaped structure island promontories, etc. They're going to know that those are the Italian ships. However, for the specifics of the Taranto attack, i.e. night torpedo and bomb attack, mostly set up with searchlights and, well, searchlights on the Italian part, flares, etc. on the British part, there might actually be a certain percentage in it. I mean, if you're going to anchor a ship in the middle of the harbour, it's fairly obvious that that is going to be a target regardless. But for ships that are closer in, maybe on alongside a quay or something, if you disguise them appropriately, because I mean, yeah, if you disguise, I don't know, Caio Duilio as like this, as a forest, yeah, there aren't that many forests at the Taranto quayside. But if you disguise it as, say, a warehouse, then in the confusion and everything of a nighttime battle and the poor lighting, it might actually be missed, because the pilots would be doing basic pattern recognition, and if they're looking around like, right, well, that's obviously a ship, that's obviously a ship. Is that a warehouse? Is that a ship? I don't know. Okay, well, let's attack the thing that's more obviously a ship. That might have protected some of the Italian vessels from being attacked. Not that the disguise would have worked in, say, a daylight assault, but in the flashes of nighttime and all the pent-up energy there, you could quite easily have missed a few ships that were vaguely cunningly disguised as something else. But it would have meant other ships that were more obvious would have received even more attention, which swings and roundabouts, considering that most of the Italian ships were, much like Pearl Harbor, were put back into service in relatively decent time. You do have the odd counterfactual of, if you do manage to hide a few of the ones that were closer into quaysides and docksides, etc., it does mean that other ships are going to get a lot more attention and thus may not be salvageable easily, if at all. So there's that as well. And that brings us to the end of this week's Drydock. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you again in another video sometime soon.